You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Hello and welcome to TFM's local watering hole for all of those franchises that we love outside of Star Trek. And we are so excited to be here with episode 449. And I'm just one of your hosts, Matthew Rushing. I'm so excited to have back with me inside the 602 Club none other than Christy Morris. Christy, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm totally ready to kick some butt.
Excellent, excellent. So you've got your karate moves down. You're ready.
Yeah, my roundhouse kick.
Sweet. Yeah. I'm so excited. And the man who taught you that roundhouse kick, none other than John Mills.
No, I thought I was a cop that went bad and was funneling stuff onto the streets. That seems more my style, let's be honest. I'm more that vibe than like revered teacher or anything like that. I'm like evil overlord construction site vibes. I mean, that's my takeaway.
You mean you're not the guy that's wheeling and dealing with the bleach tips?
No. I'm not wheeling and dealing. I'm the one running it, telling people, listen, you go along with this deal, or they're not going to be able to identify you by your dental records. So yeah, I know he didn't say it like that, but it's a good line.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, too, John doesn't have any tips to Frost, so
why you got to do that? Why I gotta say that? This is theater of the mind. They don't know that. They can't see me. It's not
well,
cool.
As everybody can probably tell, we are going to be hitting the Lethal Weapon series as we move to part 3 this week. And before we dive into that, thanks for listening. We just so appreciate you doing that. Of course, you can find us wherever podcasts can be had, and you can subscribe wherever you're listening so you'll get our episodes as soon as they come out. You can also find us on social media at the 602 Club on what used to be called Twitter, and Instagram at the 602 Club TFM. You can also find us online with the entire network at trek.fm. Plus, you'll find us on Facebook at facebook.com/trekfm. There is a listeners-only discussion group that you can join there called the Babel Conference. Just type that into the search field there. You'll be able to find us and join and talk to listeners from all over the world. And last but not least, you can support us over on Patreon at patreon.com/trekfm and make sure that all of this quality entertainment keeps coming to you each and every week. So before we get into anything, I just kind of wanted to know from both of you, this is the third movie. And so, John, was this a movie that you saw in the theater at all, or was this a movie that
you were... Okay.
I thought it was.
Of course. This was a big summer movie of 1992. There was no way I wasn't going to Wheaton Plaza and seeing this with my friends, which I did. And it was probably Wheaton Plaza 11, because the one inside the mall was Wheaton Plaza 4. That was the rinky-dink little theater. It wasn't great presentation. We thought Wheaton Plaza 11 was better presentation. But as I look back on it, it wasn't. But yeah, saw this with all my friends back in May of 1992. We were all abuzz to see the new Lethal Weapon movie. Of course, we were buzzed to see just about everything back then. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. It was a simpler time.
Yes.
Christy, obviously, I know for you, this probably would not have been a movie you would have seen in the theater. Do you remember coming across part 3 for the first time?
I don't. Honestly, the first one was the most memorable for me as far as seeing it for the first time. But I know this one I saw many a time growing up at home, later when it came out on home video. But yeah, in the theater, no, because I was 5. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I'm right there with you in that sense. I, of course, did not see this in the theater either. And part of that is because, it came out in 92, and this was not the type of film my parents would have taken me to at that point. I think my first time coming across this was actually watching all of them to get ready for the fourth one as either it was coming out or, maybe had just been released at that point when I saw it, I think on home video. I didn't see the fourth one in the theater that I remember. But so this was for me just part of a progression of watching through all of these films. And since most of them had come out at a point where, my parents, again, were not going to take me to these movies. And so especially, I think, that first one would not have been a film that my parents would have showed me back in the day.
Yeah.
And so, but I'm interested then for all of us, because rewatching this, I totally forgot that this movie starts off with an explosive opening and using this building that was going to be destroyed in Orlando and using that real explosion here for the opening of this movie. And I kind of wanted to, as we come back to the series and then, this third film, how do you feel like this sets the tone then for what's to come in this third movie?
Well, I mean, it doesn't really tie into the plot per se, but at the very least, like it reminds you of what these characters are like and what they're about. So in that sense that, it's an action blockbuster spectacle. So it sort of makes sense to do something like this, which is a throwaway little adventure to get people into the thing of like, this is what these guys are like, and craziness ensues. I mean, is it the best use of screen time? Not really. But, there have been worse. It's cute. It's at least they saved the cat.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we can get into the animal rights part of this later, but I think same kind of thing as John was saying. It's typical for what you expect if you've seen 1 and 2 of reintroducing you again to what Riggs and Murtaugh are like in their relationship. But as far as being useful to the overall story, it's really not. And may even be a little bit more extreme, I guess, way of getting the attention right out the gate. But, I mean, it works. And, I mean, I do want to say props to the whole team making the movie on making something that was going to happen anyway work for them.
Yeah, and filming an explosion, this is one of many points where I'm sure I praise Jan de Bont, because I think he was a great action cinematographer. You can definitely tell, like, if you look at this, you're like, oh, definitely photographed by the same guy that photographed Die Hard. Like, it is absolutely clear as day. And they got great coverage for that explosion. They definitely milked that for every inch of celluloid that was running. You could tell that was like a 300 camera setup, and that editor probably never wanted to watch another explosion in his life, where he was like, oh my gosh, how many times we're going to cut as many times as possible to use as much footage as we can.
They did have a lot of angles.
Yes, they did.
It's interesting because I was thinking about, as both of you were talking, and then I was just thinking about the film, after I got a chance to rewatch it. And, this very much reminds me of those later Roger Moore Bond movies where the opening definitely has nothing to do at all with the plot whatsoever. And it's really just, like you said, Christy, is attention grabbing. Hopefully that's what they're looking for, is to just kind of get your blood pumping. And so I think that's part of it here. But the other thing that this actually, I think it does set the tone in the sense that this film, is one that it's going to have a lot of humor in it, maybe even more so than the first two. And that by doing this opening with these two guys, I think it just sets the tone that the film is really going to be about them and their relationship. What the things they're going through, those are important, but what they're going through personally is almost going to be as important as just any plot point elements. So it's interesting to me that I felt like it did set the stage for the fact that, yeah, we're really going to care more about character in this movie than we are going to care a lot about the plot.
Yeah, I would even take that a step further and say it's not even concerned really with character development so much. Like it's very episodic. Like this feels like, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sort of way, especially because the way things have changed, but it feels more like a TV series at this point. Riggs and Murtaugh are only going to advance but so much, because if they ever take them out of this sort of zany buddy space, the whole thing falls apart. And I think they're self-aware enough. I think the comedy is a bit of a compensation for the fact that regardless of what I thought, my general sentiment that I picked up from people is that people weren't as nuts about Lethal Weapon 2 as they were about the first Lethal Weapon. So I think they just said, you know what, let's just come back and have a good old time. And everybody loves the chemistry of these people. And let's just, have some fun. I don't think that there's any real weight to this outside of the fact that, there's sort of like an obligatory, you can tell definitely what was on people's minds politically at the time with the whole getting the guns off the streets and the cop killer bullets and stuff like that. It's very much political talking points. Gang violence had taken over LA. I mean, this movie comes out just as people were becoming very, very, we were kind of getting close to the other side of it, but we had spent years obsessed with the idea that gang violence was going to absolutely destroy all of LA. And by the time it was the late 90s, it was going to be a barren hellscape of nothing but terrible violence. And I guess maybe it is. I don't live there, but
so everybody's going to want to escape from LA.
Yeah. Don't ever mention that movie title again, please. Ever.
But no, I think you're right, John, in the sense that, one of the big parts, of course, and you mentioned it, that this movie does clearly lean into the changing times where, in the early 90s, we are very aware of the problem of the war on the streets, gang violence, the escalation that's happening with armor-piercing rounds making their way there, which is, terrifying. And, it's interesting because in some ways this has a very light version of that idea of the escalation that we'd see play out in something like, The Dark Knight or something where it's a really serious take. This touches on all that. But on the other side, though, I think that it's interesting to watch this movie touch on and deal with the radicalization that can happen with gang members who get sucked into this life of guns and crime from families that we see. They don't look like they're terrible families, and so I think that's another interesting thing. And the movie, of course, doesn't really want to tackle that head on. They don't really want to talk about it. It's more just there, the family of the young boy that Murtaugh has to shoot because he's shooting at him and kills in the line of duty. The father's like, you find the guy who put the gun in my son's hand. And it's like, well, your son also made those choices too. So we're not really going to have any of those discussions, but it is interesting to see them touch on something that, like you said, really is a big deal at this point. I mean, yeah, the gang violence in LA specifically was, I remember, seeing it on the news. So.
Yeah, I think to me, that's the point of this movie that they do the best, is talking about a serious issue while balancing it with some ways to have comedic relief as well in the same movie. They ride that line, I think, well. And also that sometimes when you're going through that kind of stuff, you have to find the occasional good thing that you can still have joy in or laugh about to get through it. And I think that was the most powerful too, because you get to see Murtaugh finally really break down about it and say, I knew that kid, though. It's not like, oh, it was just him or me. I knew him. He was my son's friend. I also have this guilt because I took a life and it was someone that I knew. And that he was just a kid, and that, you know, obviously he made some choices, but there's a part of it that's also just his innocence and naivety of getting into the situation that's not necessarily his fault. So it's a really terrible place for him to be in. And then seeing him and Riggs go through it together, I thought was the most powerful part of the movie.
I don't discount that at all. I think that the movie could have done a little bit better of it seemed to be lacking sort of a scene that I would have expected, say, from you flash forward many years later and you have a show like The Shield, which is saying the same sort of thing, that it's not just that these criminals on the streets are just randomly popping up with all of this stuff. They're being enabled by somebody who has connections that's causing these things to happen for an ulterior motive that they have. And they're really just pawns. And that's why, you know, Murtaugh feels so bad, is he's like, this kid wasn't a mover and a shaker. This kid was just a victim of circumstance. He didn't think there was another, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And it's surprising they don't have some more of that glue to put things together.
Right. Yeah.
Because looking at the writing credits, this is some of the craziest writing credits that I think I've seen, in the sense that it's one name for the story by, and then there's a screenplay credit, and it's like two names with the ampersand and then the word and then the same name that's on the first two credits. And it's like, so he gets a story by credit. He wrote enough of the script with one guy, and then he rewrote his own script without that guy. I'm like, it really seems like there was an easier way to convey that, but okay. You know, they got their guild rules and everything. But because of what obviously went so much into the writing of it, then it's surprising that some of those glue pieces to make it a little bit more cohesive about that point wouldn't have been there. It feels like those got sacrificed because they said, oh, well, we can have a building blowing up. Oh, we can be at a hockey game. And I think it gets a little too derailed by spectacle as opposed to focus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, because, you know, I think one of the things, kind of talking about the changing times with the villain and Jack Travis, who is this corrupt cop, you know, I think that's also a thing that, like you were mentioning, there is this hierarchy of people who are doing things for money. They're doing things for power. They're doing things for all of these type of reasons. And in what they're doing, it sucks other people into it, that have terrible unintended consequences. And many of them tend to be people that are younger. And that's, you know, when you see who's behind these things, and when you think of like the drugs and the guns, you know, it's like, it's a terrible thing. I was just watching American Gangster. What a
brilliant film!
Yeah, you know, which does a brilliant job, obviously, of showing the complete lack of regard that the people at the top of these organizations have for what they're doing to other people, just so that they can make money, just so they can attain power. And, you know, Jack Travis, obviously, I think does a great job of playing that role and playing that part here. And I think the beauty of that is that it was a massive problem. So, you know, it wasn't just about the gangs or anything. The idea of corrupt cops being a part of this, you know, there was problems all around. There's corruption on all sides, you know. Episode 3 starts as that there are heroes on both sides. Here, there are villains on both sides. And I think that's where I'm with you, John, where it does feel a little bit like the movie, if it had been able to just refine its focus and refine the script maybe one or two more times, I think this movie could have raised the bar incredibly just by being able to, I think, better pinpoint what's important in the story, what we're trying to say in the story, and be able to connect all of those things better. It's not bad. The problem is that it could have been, I think, great, and it just isn't.
Well, I think we're definitely hitting a point too with Richard Donner as a director where he's been nothing but a hit maker by this point. He's directed some of my favorite films up to this point in his career. And I think that just to sort of like tack on to that, because we're talking about what was on everybody's mind at the time and everything, every piece of entertainment or art is a reflection of what's coming on at the time. But like a truly great film, and I know Matt might roll his eyes at this, but like 1978's Superman is a product of its time, but there's a certain timelessness. It endures for a reason. Lethal Weapon 3, this is the first time I've watched it in a very long time. I always had very fond memory of it. This is Richard Donner as he's entering a very rooted in his time. Like this is a movie where you watch it and you go, oh yeah, okay, this is good for what was out back. Like I see an early 90s action movie here. I don't see a potentially transcendent piece of art like I would see even just that few years earlier with the first Lethal Weapon, where I'm like, it doesn't matter that came out in the 80s. That is just a damn good movie, right? Whereas this, I'm like, hey, this is a good early 90s movie. Like I'm already there pinning it to a time as opposed to appreciating it regardless of its context like that.
Yeah, I've seen lots of movies and TV shows have the same problem where they make it too topical and then it doesn't end up being a timeless thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it is definitely that here as well. I think the biggest thing too being the thrown in pieces about the other political popular topics of the time, like the sticker on the locker that said, what was it, like fur kills or something like that? Yes.
And getting Riggs to quit smoking is Donner's even been on record as saying if he could have gone back and not had Lois Lane smoking in the first Superman, he wouldn't have. And it's like, well, but people smoked back then. It's just, you can't beat yourself up over something like that. Yeah. But it is an extra step to say, okay, we got to have Riggs quit smoking. From one perspective, I kind of admire it because it's somebody being aware, well, he's a hero figure. I don't necessarily want him modeling bad behavior for the kids. I get that. But this is also a character who, if you watch his string of decisions, just from the very first frame of the movie, you're like, oh, he's not on the force by this point. This is really terrible. What they blew up a building and everybody's like, hey, next time wait for the bomb squad. I'm like,
yeah.
All right, there's a little suspension of disbelief right there. Yes. Oh, he pulled his gun on a guy for jaywalking as a gag. I think that's a problem too. But he doesn't smoke. I'm like, I don't know. Like we're sort of like picking and choosing the battles here.
And like you said, I mean, that's kind of a product of his time, you know, in using some of those type of things for gags. It's like going back to the beginning of the film, the idea of, them blowing up a building for the laugh is insane. But so is the pulling the gun on the guy because he jaywalked. That's because he doesn't want to be a beat cop. Like, it's like, are you kidding me?
You know, what's actually amazing about that, and I hate this about myself, that when I watched that scene, my immediate thought was, oh man, this definitely occurred before cell phone cameras. Because like,
yes.
Like today you're like, oh, that's viral on TikTok in like 3 seconds. So it's like, it's such a weird headspace to be in. But then, just to throw the movie a bone and talk about some of the humor, because Christy, you mentioned the locker room scene, they still use Riggs's craziness to great effect. Like when Riggs puts his gun in the holster and it accidentally goes off, and you suddenly see Riggs flip out, and you have that initial moment of like, wait, oh, he's providing cover. He's creating all of this commotion. And everybody's like, oh, it's just Riggs acting crazy again. And I'm like, that's using that character to a great purpose. Mm-hmm. So it's like you don't need that scene where he flips out on the jaywalker. You use that scene in the locker room, and that tells you everything about Riggs. That he's still a little unstable, but he's self-aware of it to the point where he can use it to his advantage. I think it's just a better scene, better written, there's better purpose to it than assaulting a jaywalker sort of moment.
Or a film director.
Also a questionable. I don't know if Donna was like trying to work out something against himself or the industry in that moment. I don't know.
It was weird.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you guys about the fact that there were some pretty big story changes that happened in this film. And one of the big ones was that the first few drafts of the script, Lorna is not a woman. It's a man as a character. And so one of the big changes is, of course, making her a woman, and then, having her be the love interest for Riggs. And I don't see how this movie works, honestly, without that character being who she is. And allowing, I think, Riggs to finally have that. I think that's what is one of the things that allows the character to move forward a little bit, especially after the storyline we did have in the first one. And so, to me, that's one of those things where, I think the story change to me, I'm glad they did. How do you guys feel about that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think you have a movie that is very different in its tone and very different in its execution. I mean, I'm a fan of Rene Russo anyway. This is the first movie I can really remember seeing her in. I don't think Free Jack came out first. I think I saw Free Jack because I was like, oh, hey, Rene Russo's in that. She's from Lethal Weapon 3. I'd have to look that up because Free Jack's terrible. But I think that... maybe it did come. Anyway, I'm going to go down that rabbit hole. I think
did come out first, but
okay, it did come out first. Yeah. Oh, it would have been Anthony Hopkins. Would have got anyway, whatever. Doesn't matter. I think that it. I'm trying to find a delicate way to put it, but I think it was important finally in this series to have a strong female character that wasn't just the love interest for Riggs. What I find interesting is immediately you wind up having further a glut of characters because you're obliged to bring Leo Getz back. And now you add another character to everybody. And it's like, is the crew getting a little too crowded? I'll give the movie this much credit that I like the way they use Leo in this. They just embrace the comedy aspect, and his odious origins are absent this time. So you can sort of like live with him. I can live with him a little bit better in this expression of the Leo Getz character. But I think that that's largely because Rene Russo makes that character work. I think if you miscast this role, everything falls apart. But switching it to a woman and then casting it right, I'm on the fence about whether it needed to have a romantic angle to it. But at the same time, it's Mel Gibson. He's a heartthrob at this point. So it feels like there was no way you were going to escape that. Feel like that was going to happen no matter what. So, okay, fine. At least you had a good character have it happen with.
Yeah, I do appreciate what you said for sure, John, about having a female character that doesn't need to be a love interest for him would be nice. But then also it's understandable with the track that his story has taken up to this point, deserving to finally find something again. And I think that if it had been the original script with a male character that's supposed to be like his match, it wouldn't have worked, because if you stick true to Riggs as a character, the only male he really has any respect for is Murtaugh, and he always has an issue with anybody else. At the very least, doesn't trust any other man he knows or has met, and then would suddenly have this person coming in. I just don't see him ever bonding with them or trusting them or anything. So that's why I feel like it wouldn't have worked if it wasn't a female and cast well, and that Rene Russo makes it work. I think especially having that scene where they're comparing the battle scars. It reminded me of that scene in Jaws. Obviously, that was two guys, but, it was like they were equals. So that at least was redeeming to me, of like, she's saying, no, I've been around. I'm not just a desk worker.
I think the thing that the reason I asked the question with the story changes is one of the big things that they decided they didn't want to do that was in the script originally is Riggs and Rhiannon finally having an affair together, which I don't like that at all. The last thing I want is for, Riggs, who's become part of this family, to sleep with his daughter. Like, that just is kind of icky. I would not have liked that at all. I think it would have just been ugh. And so by changing the male character to a female character and then making her a love interest for Riggs, but also, I think, John, you rightly pointed out, she's an important character for the story and a character in her own right, and one who actually can stand up to Riggs as a character as well. And I think that's what makes her a true standout here. But I think she saves us from a really terrible decision that they almost made, where, in the first few scripts, the Rhiannon idea just like creeps me out.
Yes. Yeah, when I saw that, I was like, oh, thank goodness they didn't do that. Because, again, it's like their history up to this point, they're like brothers. He's part of their family. So that would be seriously crossing a line that no one even needed to talk about, as far as the characters go. Like, you would just know that's not okay. So I'm glad that they end up just joking about it and nothing happens.
Yeah, people like to think that, in the past, it's like, no, even in 92, people would have been like, oh, whoa, that doesn't really, and to your point, Chrissy, about them being brothers and everything, it was kind of cute that she had this sort of like puppy love thing for Riggs, and he took his opportunities to just sort of like make Murtaugh, uncomfortable. Like, and there was never any intent on Riggs's part to follow through with anything. He was doing it just to be like, I don't know, just like make Murtaugh be like, shut up, man. Like that's just giving your friend a hard time. Going down that road, though. Bleh.
And that's I think a road you could never recover from, and it's one of those things where I think you would everybody would turn on the character of Riggs, because there is that betrayal then between the brothers,
and even just the age difference.
Exactly,
it's a minor hurdle.
Exactly. Yeah. Minor. Yeah, that's good.
Get the joke. Get the joke.
I like that pun. That's a good one. I couldn't agree with you guys more. I think we already talked a little bit about one of the big changes that we got too is that Donner, when he comes in and he's reworking the script, he makes this more a story about Riggs and Murtaugh and their relationship than he does on the story focus. And I think that's clear. We already kind of talked about that, where it felt like you could do both, and I think this is one of those places where, I don't know if it's just where Donner is at this point in his filmmaking career, but it felt like he felt like you needed to sacrifice one for the other. And I think, a good writer finds a way to do both. And, so obviously, as you talked about too, John, this has an interesting writing history. And I think that shows. And so, and you mentioned too, and another thing, he brings back Leo Getz. And again, everybody can sample this. I'm with John on this in the sense that I think he's a much more palpable character in this movie than he was in the second movie, where he was just so over the top. I think here it's almost like, I don't know if you'll crucify me for this, but it's almost like people complained about the Leo Getz character in 2, the same way people complain about Jar Jar Binks in The Phantom Menace, and so you kind of get less of him in the other films, and I think he works well in those other films, and then the way they work him into the Clone Wars is actually genius. But I feel like here they found a way to make the character make more sense for why he's kind of still in their lives and everything, and utilize him, but also keep him on the sideline so he's not overtaking the film in the way he kind of does so much of the second movie too. So yeah, I think in that it was a good move to bring him back, but the way they brought him back and the way they utilized him, I think works so much better.
You're right. I mean, you're both right. I think they may have even gotten feedback about it and listened to it this time is kind of what it felt like. Although I like the character, I think that you can have too much of him.
I definitely think you can have too much of him. I think that something else to sort of keep in mind is, if I'm not mistaken, doesn't he win an Oscar for Goodfellas between Lethal Weapon 2 and Lethal Weapon 3? So the cost of his screen time would have gone up considerably.
Probably,
so
yeah.
his scaled back role would have probably made a lot of sense to be like, oh, I can't really afford all of Joe Pesci. Let's afford a little of Joe Pesci.
That may be it too.
Yeah.
Although I get the feeling like these guys just like working together, because obviously they come back and do 4 finally in 98. And he has a major role in that one too. So, I mean,
spoilers.
I think these guys just like working together. So, which, John, I think we talked about before on other podcasts, but, Gibson and Glover could not be more polar opposites when it comes to, thought process, political ideology, all those type of things. And yet they're best friends. So it's one of those things where it's like, it seems like this was a cast that got along really well. And just, if the phone rang and they're like, yeah, we're doing Lethal Weapon 200, they'd be like, yeah, we're doing it, Well,
I mean, until Donner died, they were talking about doing a 5th one.
Yep.
And kind of a shame, I guess. Yeah. It would have been interesting to see them come back at it after so many years later. But
although, I mean, heck, I honestly, I'd still like 4. To see them do it, but I
don't know.
I haven't seen Lethal Weapon 4 in a long time, and I remember really loving that movie, so I'll just leave it there. But I think that's a good call. I do want to ask you one thing. Why are we back in the bathtub again? Have we not learned that those scenes are super awkward and nobody should be bothering a man in his bath except his wife?
Well, this time at least he got a placemat or something laid over him.
Yeah, it's a plus, but I mean, the thing is, I think I've gone on record that baths are disgusting to begin with, so I don't understand why anybody takes them. So I'm the wrong person to ask. It's being in a stew of your own filth. Why would you do it? High pressure shower wash like Kramer had in Seinfeld, strong enough to blast clean an elephant. I want a power washer. I would be in and out in 2 minutes and I'm done.
John has a car wash at home.
If only, Christy, if only. That would be the best.
My sister-in-law their house, and before they sold that house in Arizona, had basically one of those car wash like showers, had the side things, and the big rain thing.
Oh,
and
it had
just
like
ridiculous.
5 different spigots or whatever.
It was amazing.
Oh my gosh.
But
Set the stopwatch.
It's just weird.
And you would have thought, too, we would learn that the bathroom is just a dangerous place after the toilet bomb.
Exactly. Exactly.
And never mind the fact, like, going along with that, they have a big shootout among porta potties. So, in essence, I really think that Murtaugh, I think there's some sort of, like, ancient curse in his family about bodily functions and death. That's like, I think that we should explore this in an expanded universe Lethal Weapon book. That like his ancestor had a curse placed on him that never shall you be near a toilet that is safe. I don't know. I think we got potential.
Oh my gosh.
That's good.
So we've talked about the idea that this movie does have so much to do about Riggs and Murtaugh and their relationship. And, I thought this movie really struck a chord with me this time in watching it, because it did seem to be about good men. And, these guys obviously haven't had the smoothest relationship. And yet I feel like this movie is very much about the importance of good male relationships and how important they are for men and what they can mean in their lives. And I thought that scene on the boat was it was so well acted. Murtaugh struggling with the, having to kill somebody his son knew to survive. And, the hard part of all of this about, Murtaugh going to retire and what that's doing to Riggs, because this relationship has brought him back to life, after the loss of his wife and basically being in a place where, as we saw in the first movie, he's suicidal. He wants to die. He has a death wish. And these two men have found a way to make each other better men for all the craziness, because of the fact that they love each other. And they even say it in this movie, which there was something so wonderful about that in this film for me. And I really appreciate that this movie allowed these two characters to be able to say what they were feeling and not make it seem like that can't be something and shouldn't be something that men actually do. Like, you're not less manly for sharing your feelings to another dude about the other dude and how important they are to your life. It really got to me, and I really appreciated Donner adding this in the film. I thought this was maybe Donner's best decision in the movie when he decided this movie is going to be more about these guys, to make sure that a scene like this plays out, because I really think that brings it home.
I agree. I think that what's interesting is in the 90s, the notions of masculinity were shifting. And I know that sounds like I'm saying it in a loaded way, but I'm not. If you look at the films of the 1990s, the way that masculine characters were approached shifted. The way it's dealt with here, I think, none of these circumstances are realistic, but it has more of an emotional realism in the way that Murtaugh and Riggs relate to each other about these very heavy things than you will encounter in a lot of 90s movies that attempt to do this thing or attempt to soften their characters and make them a little bit more open about things. I think that this movie owes so much of why it works at all to that underlying real world chemistry that exists between Glover and Gibson. And all due credit to Donner, a director who's wise enough to know, get out of the way, they'll make it happen, and this can work very effectively. And yeah, it is nice to see a relationship like that reinforce the idea that, it's okay to talk about these things that are hurting and to admit it and open up to someone and relate to another another person, guy to guy sort of thing. But Christy, I'd be so curious, like, does that resonate as much? It's a buddy cop movie sort of thing, and these are two guys having that emotional thing. Does it resonate as much, from like your perspective? Like, does it cross that barrier and you think men and women can relate to this in the same way?
Definitely.
Okay,
yeah.
good.
Well, I mean, of course, it's going to be a slightly different way just because different genders, but I look at it as transcending that, and that I would say I've been in the same kind of situations where you're getting to know somebody on a deeper level, and that me and a female friend finally have that first in-depth bonding moment like that. And I mean, this wasn't their first, but you get what I mean.
Yeah.
And that's something that I really liked about this scene, was that just with the writing, but then also especially because of Glover and Gibson's portrayal, they get past the surface layer of the conversation. And it's almost like they as characters won't let each other move on to another topic or make a joke out of it, and actually confront each other and say, no, like, let's really talk about this. Mm-hmm. And even have that moment with Murtaugh crying, I think drove it home even more of like you were saying, Matt, that those feelings are not something that especially even guys should be ashamed of showing, and that men do cry, even if, you may not want to brag about it. It happens. And for a situation like that, it's warranted. And so I definitely am on the same page with that being such an essential scene, and that the director saw the value in letting you sit with that for a minute. Yeah.
Well, and not only do you get to sit with it a minute, but then I think he follows it up in a way that feels wonderfully classic, where they end up punching each other and falling off the boat, and then they make the joke to the police about, we're just in
the middle of a case.
Another bottle. Yeah, another case of a scotch, So, like, it works so well because I do think it feels so real for so many men, and again, I think to normalize the fact that, men do have emotions, and that there's nothing wrong with sharing them with one another is great. And, I think you've got what we would consider two very masculine men, and Danny Glover and Mel Gibson doing that. I think that's great. And I think, more films should do it even today this way. I think it's awesome. So,
well, and realizing too that that's the power of the whole series, is that it comes back to whether or not the two of them work and work well together, and keeping that going.
It's a very good point. I wanted to ask you guys too, with the final fight. This is another place where they used and utilized something very real. It was at an abandoned housing development, and there was nothing happening with these unfinished houses, and so they utilized them to the fullest. So all of this stuff is real, and, it's just one of those things where it almost felt like, okay, they were like the opening. It's like, okay, where else can we utilize something that nobody cares about, but we can, have this incredibly real sequence. And it didn't really necessarily matter what the final sequence was. They just wanted somewhere where it could be real. And I was like, wow, this is great stuff, because we're in a real environment. We're in a place where it fits with the story too, that then they were able to utilize with the bad guy. And then we're able to have this ridiculous firefight in a place we would normally never get to destroy like this. But I was just really impressed in the end.
It's a hat tip to the producer or producers. Yeah. Seriously. Like the production on this, it able to find these locations and say, hey, listen, hey, and whatever faults I might have with the script or the process or anything like that, credit to the script writers for making it work as well as it did. And undoubtedly, hey, I have a draft. Oh, we're going to get this. And it's going to get in a firefight. Great. I found a housing project we can blow up. Rewrite it. All right, sure. Hey, I got this scene. Well, we found a building we can blow up in Orlando. Rewrite it. Okay, we'll take that and we'll move it over here. Filmmaking is something that has a large number of people, but I think that producers get overlooked too much in those terms. We'll talk about directors, we'll talk about actors, we'll talk about music, we'll talk about special effects. But man, the producers who are going out there and making that stuff happen, I think in this case is a big deal. And so the production crew definitely deserved a big, big thank you for finding it, because it is a memorable final fight. Like, the first thing I actually think of, well, there are two things I think of first when I think of this movie. Mel Gibson eating dog biscuits and the final fight. Okay, three things. Rene Russo. So those are the three things I think of when I think of Lethal Weapon 3. But hey, so it's a testament to how memorable it is, and the production staff finding it. Boffo job.
Well, then I'm going to come in and be the curmudgeon this time.
Oh, no, Christy, come on. The whole world gets turned upside down. Don't do this.
So the only thing I'll say is that with the writing side of it, I still don't fully understand what it has to do with the rest of Jack Travis's mission as an ex-cop who is distributing all of these guns and ammo to also be a person constructing a neighborhood. Is it his cover business?
Yes.
Because it's just not super clear is all I'll say.
Yeah, it's his cover business. He's utilizing that so people don't know that, he's basically utilizing it to launder the money and the guns. And as a base of operations. So yeah.
To Christy's point, it's not the clearest that it could be.
It's true.
It feels a little flimsy.
I will say that it's the ending itself, the rewriting it to have the final firefight in the housing project. The lead up, I agree with you, isn't very clear. The one thing that I actually wind up stumbling on is he grabs a guy for screwing something up who's working on a house, and then he drowns him in concrete, which is really, that's just a brutal way to go. That's awful. But does that mean everybody working construction on that site is also a part of the criminal enterprise? Because that is the part that seems to me, that's a bit too much of a leap of faith to say. So you don't even have any union electricians there that aren't working with you, because there's a whole lot of stuff that goes into building a neighborhood
that wouldn't have seen you and a couple other guys, as accomplices to murder.
He can't possibly, it's,
yeah, the
scale of it's pretty nuts. So yeah, I'll give you that. When I talk about rewriting, I'm talking about rewriting the ending so that they have an effective set piece at the end.
Yeah.
Not so much the mechanics of how Jack Travis is.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
But as far as how the scene works, yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. Full props to the production crew for lining up the time frame to be able to make the demolition of the building and this neighborhood work with what they needed to do. Because that is a bear just to try and line up to be on the same time frame.
Yeah.
And it's cool. I mean, like I said, they're able to take something that was already going to happen anyway and make it work for them and keep their budget a little bit lower. So,
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about it, 92, this cost $35 million production, not including marketing, to make. Batman in 1989 was around 30 million. But by this point, Terminator 2 had crossed the $100 million production mark, and it was released in 91. So the fact that you get this much bang for a third of the buck of Terminator 2 is kind of impressive. I know you don't have any groundbreaking visual effects in this, but it is kind of impressive that you have something with this much scale and this much action and all of that stuff, and two relatively high-powered stars. I mean, and an Oscar winner and a this and a that for 35 mil. That's kind of a bargain, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was an awesome scene. I think of the bulldozer when I think of this movie.
Yes.
And then just to throw it in there, I forgot about the scene. Although I knew that obviously Mel Gibson and Rene Russo end up being each other's love interest, I forgot that in that whole kerfuffle that she grabbed a handful of something. Don't know if you noticed that.
Was it?
She definitely grabbed his butt.
Oh, yeah, I was going to make a joke, but yes.
Who
yes,
wasn't grabbing Mel's butt in the 90s? So I'm just saying.
I hope not everybody was. I was comfortable with it whenever it happened.
Maybe Glover did. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Maybe Rene Russo was like, no, Richard, I need another take.
Could I? Exactly.
Yeah, that one wasn't as good. We could do better.
She was grabbing arguably one of the, I guess you could call it a spotlight butt of Hollywood at the time. Yeah. So, I guess that's a perk of the job.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you guys, we talked a little bit about this with first two, of course, with, the soundtrack is again done by Michael Kamen as well as Eric Clapton, David Sanborn. And so I wanted to ask you how you guys felt about this soundtrack, because, I remember for number 2 specifically, we felt like it felt very over the top and too much. So, did you also feel that about this soundtrack, or did they find a way to tone it down for you?
I will very briefly say that Michael Kamen should be ashamed of basically just ripping off his own Die Hard soundtrack for this. There are specific cues where I'm like, oh, I know exactly where I heard this music in Die Hard. This isn't even borrowing a transitional cue. This is like entire segments where I'm like, if I closed my eyes and you put this on, I'd be like, I'm listening to the Die Hard soundtrack. Which, trust me, I have committed to memory. And I'm like, no. And I even know exactly what scene is in Die Hard where I'm hearing that. So it's very disappointing. But then to give it a positive, I love the opening song for the opening credits. And it always vexed me that I like the opening credits version of the song better than the version they wound up releasing on the soundtrack. It has a catchier, not catchier, but like it has there's more verve to the beat behind it than there is in the soundtrack version. So I think that It's Probably Me is a great song to kick it off, but then Kamen ripping himself off is a pretty big disappointment later in the film.
Well, I didn't know it was that bad.
It's pretty bad. It's pretty bad.
I guess I haven't seen Die Hard enough.
That's a shame. That's a shame.
Hey, I have seen it more than once, but not as much as you
Welcome to the party, pal.
Yeah, exactly.
Yippee-ki-yay, that's all I know.
Hey.
Anyway, for me, the music here is consistent, which I like, and definitely, I think that it's gotten to this point where it's a type that you expect for this series, that it's always going to be that slightly melancholy sounding saxophone at different points with them, and that's become like the MO of the Riggs and Murtaugh music. I think that overall for me, it's just good, but not great and not super memorable other than the style being consistent. And for me, honestly, the intro, I didn't pay a lot of attention to just because the fire graphics, or whatever you want to call it, the fire in the intro made me think, oh, this is like Mission Impossible 2.
Mission Impossible 2. I don't know. That was the weirdest series. There's a Mission Impossible and there's a Mission Impossible 3. I don't know about this 2. There was a There was a 2?
I thought they skipped 2.
There was a 2.
I thought that there was like a numbering problem and they just skipped 2 and went right to 3. It's bizarre.
But you know what I mean? Like there was this point in the 90s and the early 2000s when it was like the fire was a big thing in movie intros and outros. I don't know why. Beavis
was working on film productions at the time, apparently. And he was just saying, fire! So,
But yeah, so it was fine music-wise. But after what John said, I'm like, ooh, that is pretty bad.
Yeah, I didn't... I mean, I've seen Die Hard many times, but I did not put that together. And, I felt like the score felt less obtrusive than, what we got, I think, in the second one. So it was fine. I had no issues with it, but, to know that he basically pulled a James Horner
that is what
in that
he did.
way was very interesting. And in a way that seemed to really upset you even more than maybe some of James Horner's work. So,
James Horner, I came to expect it. Die Hard is like a sacred score to me. And so to hear like cues 1-to-1 lifted was just, it felt like a betrayal. I wouldn't have noticed it back in 92. I noticed it this time. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I can't wait to see what y'all are going to rate this movie. And so, Christy, what do you think? Lethal Weapon 3, what's your rating?
So I still really found a lot of things enjoyable about it. And after thinking over some of the critiques I did have, I think that ultimately I end up at a 3.5 out of 5. Just because, like I said, I think that the construction piece of it could have been better tied in story-wise. And, like we both all said as well, the although it was done well production-wise, that maybe it was more about the spectacle than it was about the story, and you got to make sure that your story works too. But the focus on Riggs and Murtaugh was great. Rene Russo was great. And tying in something as big as gang and gun violence to still make it a good story helped, but there were areas that definitely could have been better. So I say 3.5 out of 5.
I land with an affectionate 3. I think that what really works is what makes any Lethal Weapon venture work, which is the relationship between Mel Gibson and Danny Glover. There is a lot of that chemistry here. But the spectacle stuff does go to the point of distraction at certain points where it just doesn't gel the way that it should. And so, as much as I might come back to it at some point in the future, and that affectionate 3, I think reflects that I had a good time watching it again. But at the same time, I understand why I go back and I watch the first one, but it's been a real long time since I watched the third one. I don't have the hate in my heart for it that I do, say, with Lethal Weapon 2. I'm obviously a little more forgiving here. But yeah, this is, it's an affectionate 3.
I think I'm going to go with 3.5 as well. I think that this movie to me it's definitely better than the second movie, but it's not as good as the first. But this is one where I would, absolutely go back and rewatch this. And so, like I would watch the first one and then I'd watch the third one. I don't know if I would go, back to the second one very much. So yeah, I mean, like you said, John, too, I think with the introduction of Rene Russo in this. I think it's a really good introduction. I think she becomes a character to which I really enjoy watching on screen. And, then the thought process of seeing her again and where all that goes is great because of the introduction she gets here. So, yeah, 3.5 for me. But, John, if people wanted to catch up with you, see what you have happening these days, where would they find you?
Well, I've got nothing happening. However, you can find me on social media as Castle Junkie. You should know how to spell that. Come on now, by this point. And actually, for things that I do have happening, you can go over to the Nerd Party Network and you can hear me on 2 shows. One of them is called House Lights, where we talk about the films of directors. I co-host that with Tristan Riddell and Darren Moser. And the other one is a show called Aggressive Negotiations that Matt and I host. It's a Star Wars podcast.
Well, I have less going on than you do. So you can find me, of course, on Instagram, Twitter, and Letterboxd at Bespin Bell. And then I did have a finished show, which I did on the Skywalking Through Neverland network called Sabers and Spells with my friends Amanda and Teresa. So I hope you'll check that out. And what about you, Matt?
Well, you could find me all over social media under the name MattRushing02. Of course, here on the network, doing literary treks, The Orb, Warp 5, Saddle Up, and The Artificial Tango. You'll also find me on the Nerd Party Network outside of Aggressive Negotiations, which you should be checking out, is Owl Post, talking about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. But thank you so much for joining us.
And y'all come back now, you hear?
Thank you.